A young woman waits at a departure gate, a small suitcase beside her. Everyone who loves her believes she is flying across the world to fight for her life. None of them know the truth she is carrying onto that plane. Over the better part of a year, more than 140 people would give what they could. In the end, investigators say, none of it went toward treatment. Almost all of it went toward her. If you want more real, source-backed investigations like this, subscribe to Frond and turn on notifications. It's free, and it helps us keep making these deep dives. This is the story of a diagnosis that was never real, a community that gave everything it had, and a decade-long search that is still not over. Harleysville, Pennsylvania. A close, tight-knit suburb outside Philadelphia, the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names. It's here that this story quietly begins, in the fall of 2015. At the center of it all was a 28-year-old brain surgery student, well-liked, well-spoken, and by all accounts building a promising career in medicine. No one around her had any reason to doubt what she was about to tell them. Then came the news no family wants to hear. She told her loved ones she had been diagnosed with glioblastoma, one of the most aggressive and deadly forms of brain cancer there is. Grief moved through the family fast. Glioblastoma is real, and it is brutal. A fast-growing tumor with survival measured in months, not years. It was exactly the kind of diagnosis that makes people stop asking questions and start reaching for their wallets. Word moved quickly through Harleysville. Friends called friends. Extended family reached out. In a town this size, a young woman's cancer diagnosis wasn't just personal news. It became something the whole community felt responsible for. According to investigators, she added a second layer to the story. To survive, she would need an experimental treatment unavailable in the United States. The only place offering it, she said, was on the other side of the world, Australia. Her family didn't hesitate. If experimental treatment on the other side of the world gave her a chance, they would find a way to pay for it. That decision would set everything else in motion. A fundraising page went up online, describing her illness and her need for treatment abroad. It was shared and shared again, moving through timelines and group chats far beyond Harleysville. Small donations started arriving within hours. $5 here, $20 there from classmates, coworkers, and people who barely knew her but wanted to help someone in need. It wasn't enough just to give money online. Friends and family organized something bigger, a benefit event at a local restaurant, where the whole community could come together, eat, and give in person. On the night of the benefit, the restaurant filled with people. Neighbors who had never met her personally came anyway. By the end of the evening, more money had been raised, and more hope had been placed in a story that wasn't true. This is how these schemes work. Not through fear, but through trust, real relationships, real compassion, and a story specific enough and painful enough that questioning it feels almost cruel. Between October 2015 and July 2016, investigators say she collected close to $12,000 from more than 140 people, all believing they were funding life-saving treatment. With the money raised, it was time for the trip everyone believed would save her life. A suitcase was packed. Flights were booked. To everyone watching, it looked exactly like a family sending someone off to fight for survival. In April of 2016, she said goodbye at the airport. Family members embraced her, some in tears, believing they might be watching her leave for the most important trip of her life. She landed in Queensland, Australia, in April of 2016, somewhere on the other side of the world, far from anyone who knew her daily routine. The story she had been telling would finally meet reality. According to investigators, no hospital ever admitted her. No experimental treatment was ever administered. The medical journey her family and friends had funded, they say, simply did not exist. Instead, federal investigators say she spent her time in Australia on leisure activities, far from any hospital bed, far from any treatment plan, while back home, her family believed every day mattered in a fight for her life. Back in Pennsylvania, her family waited for updates, checking their phones for messages from across the world, holding on to every small sign of hope she chose to share with them. Eventually, she returned home. To her family, it looked like a woman who had survived a harrowing ordeal abroad. What they didn't know was that the ordeal, prosecutors would later allege, had never been real at all. Soon after returning, she told her family and friends the fight wasn't over. She needed to go back to Australia for further treatment. Once again, they organized. Once again, they gave. A second fundraising page went up. A second benefit event was planned. The same community that had already given once opened its doors and its wallets all over again. With new funds in hand, she traveled to Australia again later that year, and again, investigators allege, the pattern repeated: leisure instead of medicine, and no record of treatment for an illness that by then had never once been documented by a doctor. Investigators would later say this wasn't an isolated lapse in judgment. It was a pattern, repeated deliberately over more than a year, dressed up each time in the same convincing details. It was a small thing that started the unraveling, a friend noticing details in her story that didn't quite line up, a question asked once, then asked again, more carefully this time. Those quiet doubts eventually reached the people closest to her. Family members who had given money, who had organized events, who had believed every word began asking for something they had never asked for before: proof. Eventually, the questions reached federal investigators. What began as a family's private suspicion became the opening of a formal inquiry into where more than $11,000 in donated money had actually gone. Investigators traced the flow of the funds, from donation pages, through bank transfers, to purchases that had nothing to do with any hospital, in a country that had no record of ever treating her. When investigators sought medical records to confirm her diagnosis and treatment, they say they found none. No hospital admission, no oncologist, no paperwork of any kind, anywhere, for a disease she had described in vivid detail for more than a year. By May of 2018, federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania had enough. A grand jury was convened, and the case moved from a quiet local investigation into something far more serious. She was indicted on 15 counts of wire fraud. Each count represented a separate transfer of money, a separate lie, a separate person who had believed her. On May 3, 2018, a federal grand jury handed down 15 counts of wire fraud. A warrant was issued for her arrest the same day, and it has never been served. A federal warrant for her arrest was issued that same day. But by the time agents came looking, she was already gone, and no one, it seemed, knew exactly where. Investigators went looking for her at her last known address. What they found instead was an empty apartment, cleared out, with no forwarding address left behind. By the time the warrant was signed, she was believed to already be living overseas, back in the same country where, investigators say, she had spent donated money on herself instead of on treatment. Investigators later said she had used other names to move and live unnoticed, among them Vanessa Gulinello and Cecilia Vincent Gaeta Lazaro. Different names, they believe, for the same person still out of reach. For the people who had given money, hosted fundraisers, and comforted a woman they believed was dying, the indictment answered one question and opened a much harder one. How had they missed it? Weeks became months. Months became years. The warrant stayed active, but the trail, as far as the public record showed, had gone cold. As of the most recent public updates, authorities believe she has continued to reside in Queensland, Australia, the same region she once told her family held the only treatment that could save her life. In 2026, nearly a decade after the indictment, the case resurfaced publicly. The FBI added her to its most wanted list, hoping renewed attention might finally succeed where years of quiet investigation had not. A decade after the indictment, she remains a federal fugitive, believed to be living openly overseas under a story that once fooled the people who loved her most. When the case resurfaced, the original prosecutor's words from years earlier were repeated widely: that the scheme had preyed on the kindness of good people who only wanted to help someone in need. Her story spread quickly across news outlets and social media once again, this time to an audience far larger than the one that first believed her in 2015. With renewed attention came a fresh wave of tips. The FBI asked anyone with information about her whereabouts to come forward, through a local field office or the nearest American embassy or consulate. Investigators and reporters have noted this wasn't an isolated case. In recent years, several people across the country and abroad have been accused of faking terminal illnesses to collect money from sympathetic communities. Fraud experts say these schemes are so effective precisely because they target close, trusting communities, the very people least likely to demand proof from someone they already love. What the money never repaid was the trust that had been spent alongside it. Friendships strained, family gatherings grew quieter. A community that once rallied together now carried something harder to name. For a working-class suburb, over $11,000 was not a small sum. Money that could have gone toward rent, groceries, or a family's own emergencies instead went toward a lie. For the people closest to her, The hardest part wasn't the money at all. It was realizing that someone they had comforted through what they believed was a terminal illness had never needed comforting in that way at all. Psychologists who study these cases point to a common thread. The fabricated illness gives the deceiver total control, sympathy without suspicion, and access to resources that would never be offered under any other pretense. Somewhere along Australia's eastern coast, if investigators are right, a woman is living quietly under one identity or another, more than 9,000 miles from the community that once grieved for her. Will she ever be found? Federal warrants don't expire. Somewhere, a case file with her name on it is still open, still active, still waiting for the tip that finally closes it. Anyone with information about her whereabouts is asked to contact their nearest FBI field office or the closest American embassy or consulate. Somewhere, someone likely already knows exactly where she is. Investigators and advocates say the takeaway isn't to trust less, it's to ask more. A real diagnosis comes with real paperwork. A real fundraiser can withstand a gentle question or two. Today, Harleysville looks much like it did in 2015. Quiet streets, familiar neighbors, ordinary evenings. But somewhere in that town, a decade-old wound from a stranger who was never really a stranger has never fully closed. In the end, this case isn't really about one woman's lie. It's about how far compassion will travel when it's given freely, and how easily that generosity can be pointed in the wrong direction. Her case joined a small but growing list of similar frauds uncovered across the country in recent years, a pattern that keeps repeating because the underlying trust it exploits is never in short supply. Officials continue to urge crowdfunding platforms and everyday donors to look closer before giving, not out of cynicism, but because a few careful questions can be the difference between real help and a repeat of this story. For the people who gave everything they had to a lie, justice wouldn't be about the money at all. It would simply be an answer, a knock at a door on the other side of the world, and an end to not knowing. 9,000 miles separate a Pennsylvania suburb from a Queensland coastline. For nearly a decade, that distance has been enough to keep one woman beyond the reach of the very people she once asked to save her life. She built a story so convincing that a whole community grieved for a death that was never coming. And when the truth finally caught up, she was already gone. In some ways, she still is. A fabricated diagnosis, a real federal indictment, and a fugitive still believed to be living freely. The case of Vanessa O'Rourke remains open to this day. For many of the 140 people who gave, the money itself was the smaller loss. What they lost was the certainty that they could recognize a lie when it looked them in the face and cried. Prosecutors use a specific term for this kind of fraud: manufactured grief. The diagnosis was the weapon. The community's own compassion was the mechanism that moved the money. There is another layer to why this case has taken so long. International extradition can move slowly, especially when a person is believed to be living overseas and legal systems have to coordinate across borders. Distance, in this case, does legal work. Oncologists and medical professionals who reviewed the case publicly noted how convincingly the alleged diagnosis was described. The right terminology, the right stages, the right emotional beats. It was, they said, a studied performance. Her background as a brain surgery student gave investigators a likely explanation for how she knew the right words. She had spent years studying the language of the disease she would later claim to have. Each online donation transfer, investigators say, constituted a separate act of wire fraud under federal law. 15 donations, 15 counts. Every $5 contribution was, legally, its own crime. Investigators haven't publicly detailed every obstacle, but legal analysts say the combination of international jurisdiction, limited physical presence in the United States, and time have each worked in her favor. Investigators have also noted the possibility that her deception didn't end with her Pennsylvania community. People who knew her in Australia, under one alias or another, may have been deceived as well, without ever knowing they were. The use of multiple aliases raises a question investigators haven't publicly answered. Were the false names pre-planned before the fraud began, or were they assembled on the run, one step ahead of whoever was looking? Perhaps the hardest part for the people closest to her is that they still loved who they believed she was. Grief is complicated when the person you're grieving turned out to never have existed in the way you thought. If she is ever located and returned to the United States, the Eastern District of Pennsylvania's indictment is still fully intact. The maximum sentence for each wire fraud count is 20 years in federal prison. For now, the record ends with an empty space where an arrest should be. A case file stays open, a community waits for answers, and one question remains: how long can a lie keep moving before someone finally stops it? Sources for this investigation are in the description. From federal indictment records and FBI statements to contemporaneous local news reporting, everything you saw is drawn from the public record. If this investigation kept you watching, hit the like button, subscribe to Frond, and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. We'll see you in the next one.